Hi everyone, thanks for joining. We're going to leave it a couple minutes before we get started. Hi everyone, thanks for joining. We'll leave it one more minute and then we'll get started with today's event. Okay, great. I think we'll start there. So thank you everyone who's joined us today for this launch event of the third edition of the Training Entrepreneurs VoxDevLit. I'm Oliver Hannay, I'm the managing editor here at VoxDev, and I'm really excited to be joined by David McKenzie and Chris Woodruff, who are the senior editors of this VoxDevLit. As I mentioned, this is the third edition of the Lit, and I think this kind of demonstrates the value of this type of resource because it's been updated over the past 3 years to keep up with the latest evidence and reflect the latest research. The format of today's event is going to be a 35-minute approximately presentation by the senior editors, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. You can submit your own questions in the Q&A tab, or you can vote on other participants' questions if you'd like to see them answered, and we'll try to get round to as many of those as possible. So without further ado, I'll hand over to David.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. So let me just get these slides up. Okay, great. So I should note just to start that while Chris and I will be talking today, this is part of a collaborative effort with a great group of co-editors here too that you can see displayed here. And then as Oliver mentioned, this is meant to be a living literature review. And so if there's things that we've left out or things that, studies that about or areas that should be included that are not included, we'd love to hear about them. And, version 4 can then try and incorporate some of those as well. So, this is the advantage of this is, I guess, it never ends. It's a continual progress, and we share what we've learned so far from this evolving literature, and then where we think there's gaps and areas for new research and areas where we'd like to learn more. So, and with that said, let me sort of start with what are we talking about when we talk about training entrepreneurs? Well, this is a area where it's very hard to actually get precise numbers on how much is spent on training entrepreneurs, but at least we could document sort of $1 billion or so a year being spent, probably a lot more, aiming to teach firms around the world better business and management practices. And what do those look like? In small firms, these are the sorts of things that you might learn in any basic sort of business course of keeping your records, making sure you separate the accounts of your household from those of your business, make sure you don't run out of inventory, and which items turn over more, which things you should be pricing at what levels, how to do a budget, how to attract customers, what you should do in terms of advertising and promotions and things like that. And so these are things that we think all small firms should be doing. And these types of business training programs are trying to help firms learn those. And then in larger firms, a sort of broader set of management practices come in that involve things such as, how do you deal with your workforce? How do you attract good workers? How do you reward the good ones to stay on? And how do you deal with workers who are not working so well, whether you remove them or improve them? Things like lean manufacturing and quality control. How do you identify, where bottlenecks are occurring, where in your production process some sort of quality defect is occurring, and quickly fix it? How do you make sure that you're monitoring things well? How do you set targets and then monitor performance towards those targets and constantly try and improve? And so, there's this range of things that are sort of specific practices. And then as well, some of these training programs also try and teach more of a mindset or attitudes. How do you have this sense of innovating, of trying to make sure that tomorrow looks different from today, that I can differentiate myself from my competitors, that I can look for those opportunities and seize them when they come. And so there's an idea that maybe we can teach people to do that well as well. And because of course there's just a broad variety of firms, the right type of training is going to depend on the type of firm that we're talking about. And so there's going to be lots of different types of training programs and lots of modalities of how we try and transfer that knowledge. And so, part of what we do in this literature is try and divide this up a little bit and think about what types of training might work best for what types of firms. So, just before we get into, what the evidence is on, how successfully you can teach this, I just want to sort of start by noting that when you look around the world and in across developing countries and within developing countries, we do find that these things seem to be important. That if you look in these small firms, the picture on the left shows graphs which look at the proportion of these sort of small business practices like advertising, record keeping, inventory control, and things that firms are doing, and how much they're selling. And what we see is across sort of a range of countries, firms that do more of these practices sell more, are more profitable, they grow more, they're more likely to survive. Like, these things seem to be important for small firms to be doing. And when we look in large firms, this is work from the World Management Surveys that Nick Bloom and John Van Reenem and their co-authors have been collecting across a range of countries. Firms that have better management practices tend to also be more profitable, more productive within a country. And then when we look across countries, we see the sort of richest, most developed countries have firms that are using more of these practices, and the poorest countries have firms that are using less of these practices. And so there does seem to be something where, some of the productivity gaps across firms within a country and across countries seem to be linked to how well firms do these. And so it's quite important, if we're trying to close productivity gaps, that we can try and improve management. So this is the big question: is, okay, these things seem to matter, but can we actually teach this? And so the outline of the lit and of sort of our discussion today will be trying to look at this across a range of different types of firms and different types of programs. And so I'll start by looking at the sort of most common types of firms, micro enterprises in developing countries, and the types of programs that have been used to help them. And so this will be traditional training programs, as well as some of the alternatives that have been springing up, things such as heuristics or rules of thumb approaches, programs that are trying to teach an entrepreneurial mindset like personal initiative training, and then some of the special programs for women and youth that have been arising. Then we'll look at medium and large scale firms where, rather than just classroom training, there tends to be sort of more specialized programs, some consulting, some export focused programs, some ideas of trying to use the market, right, rather than just teaching firms, as well as some of these incubators and accelerators. And then finally, Chris will also talk about some of the alternatives to training in terms of mentoring or using peers, as well as alternative delivery modes, edutainment, online training, and consulting. What you'll see is also that I've put a few of these words here in green. This is one of the sort of things that we've done in the VoxDevLit, is each time there's an update, we try and highlight what's new in that update with sort of different colored text. So if you've read the previous ones, you can go through and just sort of skim and see, okay, what's new this time around? And one of the things, the areas that that there seems to have been more recent literature on, where there wasn't so much before, are some of these programs for youth, a little bit on programs to try and help firms export, and then particularly there's been more and more of this interest in online training and online consulting during the pandemic, but also sort of post-pandemic. How can we use new technologies to help deliver training? So we'll talk a bit about that. Okay, and then we'll conclude by saying, this, while we've learned some things, there's still a lot of open areas, and I think hopefully room for versions 4, 5, etc. So let me start with teaching skills to micro enterprises. And so, as I mentioned, micro enterprises are the most prevalent forms of businesses in developing countries. In fact, the sort of modal business is really just a firm owner who runs the business by him or herself. Maybe they have family members occasionally help out, but actually they have no workers at all. And if you look, most of the businesses for sure have less than 10 workers in most developing countries. And so the goals of these types of programs are normally to try and help people start a firm so that they have a job for themselves, or those that have firms, how can they make those firms earn a little bit more? Can they sell a little bit more, earn a little bit more profits? And the most typical way of doing this has been traditional small business training programs, where they're taught in classrooms using adult learning methods in sort of 3 to 12-day programs, often after in the evenings or on weekends, or sort of trying to work it around business hours, spread over several weeks. The typical cost is something like $177 per participant, but this can vary widely depending on the country, how long it is, etc. So it could be, up to, as cheap as $50 or up to sort of $2,000 or more, depending on the type of firm and the type of country. But that's the typical cost. And despite it costing that much, governments or NGOs normally offer this for free or a very nominal price. And so then they're trying to teach the types of business practices that we talked about before, record keeping, accounting, marketing, human resources a little bit, but not so much for these smallest firms, a lot of stock control, inventory management, and budgeting and planning. And so there's a range of these practices that you're trying to do. And what these studies typically find is that if firms are doing, say, 50% of these practices beforehand, you do get firms to start adopting some of these practices. But a typical training program like this, maybe they're doing another 5 to 8 percentage points more. So if they were doing 50% before of these practices, now they're doing 55%. Or if you think that there's 20 practices you'd like firms to be doing, you get them to do 1 more out of 20. And so this has sort of been one of the challenges, I think, with these types of programs, is that in a relatively short amount of time, it's hard to get firms to really adopt lots and lots of these practices. So what do we find from these training programs? And so, this graph looks a bit confusing at first, but let me walk you through and just tell you a little bit about how we've tried to aggregate the evidence from a range of different studies. And so, people have been trying to study these training programs for a while via randomized experiments, where they have a treatment group that gets assigned to these training programs and a control group that does not. And then they compare the outcomes of these firms over the next 1 or 2 years. And so I've got here, a list of when these studies started the training, going back to 2007, right up to about 2018. So, there's been a number of these studies. Typically, researchers have sort of worked with several hundred firms getting trained, and then they compare the profits or the sales for the firms that get trained to the firms that don't. And then what we see in the middle here is a estimate of what that effect was, along with a confidence interval. And we've written that over to the side as well. And what tended to happen in a lot of the early studies was that they found that there was sort of a non-statistically significant impact. And some of these estimates were negative, some of these estimates were positive, but the sort of message that came out of a lot of these early studies was training is not having a significant impact on business profits. But if we look closely at a lot of these studies, there was a lot of uncertainty in what those estimates were. If you worked with sort of a couple of hundred firms, then you might get an estimate like this sort of one here where it says 13.7% was our estimate for how much profits increased, but our confidence intervals includes profits decreasing by 17% or increasing by 45%. So a lot of what we sort of inferred from the early literature was it's really quite hard to measure impacts on profits. Profits are quite noisy in these firms. They're quite volatile. With small samples, it's quite hard to learn from one study. And so over time, as we've accumulated more and more evidence, we've been able to aggregate these studies and sort of try and look at the totality of evidence. And that's what the highlighted bit at the end tells us, is if we sort of put all these training studies together and we do a meta-analysis, what do we find on average? And what we find on average is that firms do seem to improve a bit from these training programs. The average increase in profits here is about 12%. For sales, we had about 5%. So, there is some impact of these training programs. It's not that training has no impact whatsoever, but it's we should be also relatively modest about how much we can expect to get from a relatively short training program. And this is sort of what we're getting, 5 to 12%. So what does that mean for cost effectiveness? Well, it's going to depend so much on how long these impacts last and how big these firms were to start with. And so, if you think about a very subsistence firm that earns $30 a month, if you get a 12% increase in profits, that's only another $3.50 a month in profits. And so, if that training costs that average price of $177, that impact has to last for more than 4 years for it to recover the cost of that training, or it needs to cover, if training was sort of at a cost like $612, that we see also for some of them, these impacts would need to last for more than 10 years. And we know that a lot of these small businesses are going to fail. About half of them will fail over 6 years. So it's going to be really hard to make a training program that's costing $177 value for money if you're offering it to very subsistence type firms. And so you need to drive down those costs to make it cost effective or increase those impacts. If we look at firms that are earning a bit more, sort of $100 a month, then you only need 18 months to cover $177 of training, and now that's getting more in the ballpark where we think, okay, that seems reasonable, and you can recover the cost of it in a couple of years. And so, in particular, a lot of our studies only measure impacts for 1 or 2 years afterwards, and so we don't have a lot of evidence yet about whether these impacts persist for many, many years. And so that's another reason where, if we can recover the value of these training in a couple of years, it sort of gives us a bit more confidence that this would be cost effective for governments to be offering to firms. So that's sort of traditional training, and there was a bit of dissatisfaction with this traditional training, and so the thought has been, can we do alternatives? Maybe other types of firms or other types of training might help. And so, one approach that's been used is to say, well, for the sort of smallest, least educated firm owners, trying to teach them all this complicated accounting and record keeping and things is going to be a bit difficult. Maybe that's a bit hard for them to learn, and maybe we can just reduce what they need to do to a few heuristics, to a few rules of thumb. And so, for example, rather than trying to get you to keep separate accounts physically for your household and your business, maybe you actually have separate drawers where you put your money for your business in one drawer and your money for your household in another drawer, and you be very clear about separating all your finances that way. You sort of try and have these rules of thumb about when you order new goods, etc. And this could be a lot easier for you to learn than trying to learn all these complicated systems for inventory control and for record keeping. And so this seems to help the smallest and least educated firms run their businesses a little bit better, but it's unclear. We don't have a lot of evidence about how long these rules of thumb last and whether they extend to a broader range of practices. I haven't seen so many rules of thumb, for example, for marketing or for how you think of new innovations as you do for how to separate your accounts, for example. The second area that's come up is this idea of mindset being really important, that that it's not enough just to be doing the same thing as everyone else around and doing the same thing every day, but really trying to get people to have this mindset of doing something different. So the strand of this that has received most attention perhaps has been personal initiative training, where the idea here is that you're really trying to be proactive, search continuously for new opportunities, learn from your errors, and think about, ways to differentiate yourself from others. And so, as an example of how an exercise in this type of training could be quite different from an exercise in the traditional training, here would be one exercise where you look at the daily routine of a small grocery store and you see, okay, we opened up our store, we put out our usual advertisements, we wait for customers to come, our suppliers tell us, we're having trouble today, we hope it's going to get better, a customer comes, we don't have what they're looking for, so we send them next door, we serve some customers, and at the end of the day, we sort of say, oh, it's not been that great a day. And so then what this exercise has you do is to say, let's look at each point in the day. What could I do so that tomorrow doesn't look exactly the same as today? How can I, be proactive and not just react to what's happening in my business, but actually try and, do something so that I start having days that look different from every day that I've had beforehand. And being in this mindset of how can I look for these new opportunities is what this training is trying to do. And so, I worked on one study with a group of co-authors in Togo where we tested this against a traditional training program, and it was very successful there. There was a 30% increase in profits, 3 times that of the traditional training, and this attracted a lot of policy interest. And so, this type of training is now being tried in a dozen or so other countries, and on average, it's had an impact on profits of 14%, so a little bit less than that Togo example, and a lot of heterogeneity in results. And one of the sort of things that we've been learning is that I think the quality of the trainers might matter a lot more for this type of training than for traditional training. It's less, here's the steps by the book where anyone can just sort of pick up and learn how to do accounts or learn how to do advertisements, and trying to motivate people and teach them that mindset. I think it's been a little bit harder to think about how to scale that work, and that's one of the areas that people are working in ongoing work that hasn't made it into version 3, but that will hopefully be in version 4. We've been tracing these impacts long term, and we're seeing these impacts persist after 8 years in Togo. And so they do, this does seem like it could put people on a new track where they are, continuing to do this well for years. And so I think this is an area where we still want to learn a bit more about, which seems promising. Now, we often hear from policymakers saying, okay, I want to do this not just to help the business owners themselves, but because I think it's going to generate new jobs for the community, for others as well. And the message we have from looking at this literature is that regardless of whether you do traditional training or these rules of thumb or these personal initiative training programs, when you're working with these small subsistence firms, at least over the sort of first couple of years, there really is not going to be any job creation whatsoever. The average impact and the impact in just about every study is that there are no additional jobs created for others. What you're doing is creating a job for people who are starting these firms, and you're helping them earn a bit more in the job that they have if they're already running one of these firms. But these firms are small. There's room for them to grow without them needing to hire other workers. These firms would need to grow quite a bit for it to be profitable for them to hire other workers. And if you're getting sort of a 12, 15, even a 30% increase in profits, you might be able to do that with the existing amount of labor that you already have. And so, I think we need to be realistic about how much job creation we can get from these types of programs. I mentioned that, there was also efforts to look at whether we need to adapt these programs for different groups. And so one of the groups that's received a lot of attention has been women, where there's these ideas that these additional barriers to firm growth that women face, such as, being in the wrong sector, or maybe they need to, deal more with household tasks or stereotypes or things like that. And so there are programs that are designed to help overcome those barriers, as well as work on traditional areas, and programs evaluated in Vietnam and Kenya, which have shown lasting impacts, which don't seem to come at the expense of other women in the market. What's unclear, though, is how much the gender aspects of these training are contributing on top of traditional training. So we haven't seen studies yet that say, these gender specific elements rather than the other elements are the key things. Where gender seems to be also important, and where there is a little bit more evidence, is on how you recruit people for these training programs in the first place. For example, allowing women to bring a friend along might make them more likely to show up and take part in training, making it easier for them to attend in terms of offering childcare or close locations or the hours that you offer training. These types of design features, I think, can be very important in ensuring that the training programs that you do have are ones that women are able to participate in. One of the areas I mentioned that we've seen sort of newer work in has been with youth. And there's three types of programs that have been working with youth that we've seen arising. Sort of one is for unemployed youth who are out of school, trying to help them start or expand businesses. Often, because these are young, poor, out of work people, the programs that we see try and combine training with some other component, such as giving them a small asset or a small grant. And so it's hard to say how much exactly is just the training component versus the training and the cash alone. This evidence is sort of starting to come. That seems a little bit short-lived and modest at the start. It gets people to go into self-employment, but so far we haven't sort of seen lasting impacts on their overall employment or overall income from the programs that we've seen for these types of groups. The two other types of programs are work where you're looking at students in their last years of secondary school or students that are in universities. Now, the challenge here is that it can take a while to evaluate because these students are still in school. They might go on to more school. And so you might need to follow them for quite a few years before you can actually see what's happening in the labor market. And so, for example, a study of this Educate program in Uganda found even 4 years later, 36% of the sample was still in school, which makes it hard to think carefully about all the business outcomes. A different program, though, in Uganda and some work in Tanzania have found that these secondary school programs, when they're well taught, have led to increases in self-employment and large percentage increases in earnings. But this is in a situation where the control group really earns hardly anything. And so you get these very large percentage increases on sort of very low bases. And then finally, there's some early promising signs from this program called STEP that combines some of this personal initiative and psychology-based training programs with some of the basic business fundamentals with working with university students in African universities. But this is just starting to emerge, and I think we need to see more on that. So, I think the big challenge for working with youth is just this flux in the labor market and high failure rates. And so, you need to look at what's going on in their total labor income, not just their businesses, and sort of track over longer periods to see, what happens as they move in and out of self-employment and in and out of the labor market. So then this is, the final thing from me, and then I'll hand over to Chris, is just sort of starting to look at medium and large scale firms and high growth startups, which is an area where the early research didn't really focus so much on because there's far fewer of these types of firms, so the sample sizes tend to be smaller. It's a lot more expensive to work with these types of firms, so the interventions have been more costly, and the same types of NGOs that you would work with for looking at small business training are not the types of partners that you would work with when looking at these programs. But now there's a growing evidence base. And so let me just mention, one type that's sort of an in-between, I think, from the small business training and the consulting that Chris is going to talk about next, which is this Japanese approach of Kaizen, or continuous improvement, which really focuses on lean manufacturing techniques like reducing bottlenecks, maintaining equipment, reducing waste. It's sort of taught almost in a classroom cluster. You work with firms in a particular industry like metalwork or knitwear, help them learn from one another a bit, that Chris is going to talk about as well, but also really teach them these lean manufacturing techniques. And so there's been some a variety of studies that have looked at these programs on sort of small samples each time, and there seems to be sort of large but pretty imprecise impacts on profits and some significant impacts on firm survival. So there seems to be some promise to this, but I think we need to test it on a large scale and compare it to some of the approaches Chris is going to talk about, such as more standard consulting. So let me hand over to Chris, and then he will take it from here.
Great, thanks, David. Thanks for getting us this far. And let me say to the audience that we ended up with the division where David had more than half the material. So I'll finish in time for us to get to some of the questions that are coming in. So as David said, this is the Kaizen is a nice transition from kind of thinking about more group small firm training to more customized training that can be offered to larger or smaller firms. But when we think about training and business improvement in higher income countries, we tend to think, and larger firms, we tend to think most of it happens through consulting markets and through use of consulting services. The first couple of studies here that David was also involved in, but Nick Bloom and others look at large firm consulting with a group of textile firms in India, and find quite significant effects on productivity, quality, revenues, and reasonable returns on what the consulting services would cost at market rates, which raises a question about why firms, these larger firms in particular, which we might think of as not being quite so capital constrained, are not procuring consulting services more. For smaller firms, I'm going to say I think the evidence is somewhat more tenuous on this sort of consulting services, and one of the issues with smaller firms is, of course, we have to somehow make these services cost effective, even though firms are not as large. One study that shows significant positive effects on average is a study by Brun et al. In Mexico, which has a rather heterogeneous sample of micro, small, and medium firms, and in the longer term follow-ups, which show significant positive effects, they use administrative data from the government, but because of confidentiality issues, they get the longer term data in aggregate for the full sample of firms. So it becomes difficult to figure out whether these effects are caused by a few of the very large firms or are more generally spread across the distribution, and so forth. And there's a lot of heterogeneity, but there is here, at least a finding of some promise of consulting, more customized consulting in smaller firms. And then again, the question becomes kind of, how do you make this training cost effective? And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about online training and how, and I think one of the issues we're gonna want to think about is how we combine online more standardized training and customized individualized training. But another approach to this is to think about training firms in groups, and the group training can provide, and this Iacovone et al. Paper that works with groups of auto parts manufacturers in Colombia, taking firms that all face very similar circumstances, and that there's a mixture, in a sense, of the consulting services, and because it's group training, perhaps some peer effects as well from learning. But the results of that study suggest that group training lowers costs while retaining effectiveness. And again, I would put this in the category of tenuous, because this is one specific context with a group of firms which are quite similar, and the question is whether this can work in broader kinds of settings. And then finally, a paper that I think is quite provocative and interesting, and really sort of points in the direction where we really need to go and have much more evidence, is a paper by David and Steve Anderson in Nigeria, with, again, smaller scale firms, that compares the traditional training, what I think of as traditional consulting, individualized consulting, with either insourcing or outsourcing. So having an HR consultant help the firm hire a marketing person or an accounting person for a window of time to help the firm set up processes and understand why these types of individuals may be relevant. And the insourcing and outsourcing, I think it shows some promise in the sense of being somewhat more cost effective, but also having effects that are comparable to consulting. So then, when we think about, and I think there's some questions in the Q&A about how should we be thinking about what the objectives are here of the training, and whether the objectives are within the firm or about employment growth. There is a set of firms out there that are these potentially really high growth firms that we would think are firms that are going to generate employment growth and generate changes in the markets in an economy, and so incubation acceleration is something that's quite commonly used and certainly believed by the participants to be effective in higher income countries as well, and is increasingly used, quite frankly, across a pretty broad range of types of firms, from the true sort of Y Combinator, super fast potential growers, to scalable but perhaps firms without the quite sort of such high ceilings, but has been used and is increasingly used in lower income countries, lower and middle income countries as well. The challenge in understanding what the effect of acceleration is that these the cohorts are often small, so it makes any individual program difficult to sort of study and understand, and they're also highly selected. The one of the things the incubation acceleration programs do is try to select who they think the firms that will benefit most from this. There are a couple of studies that have somewhat cleaner identification, I think. Let me, in the interest of time, I'll say quickly something about the Startup Chile project, which is basically regression discontinuity kinds of designs, but on a sample that's big enough where the margin of selection or exclusion from the program is not so steep, in a sense that the differences are somewhat smaller. The first outcome of this is that the basic program, Startup Chile, which offers office space and a small grant, doesn't seem to have any significant effect on subsequent growth of the firms, but that a program that provided additional training in sort of a university style, a mini MBA style kind of training did help firms grow faster. Paper that I find sort of, I guess, academically satisfying, as well as something that I think we learned something from, is the Gonzalez Uribe and Reyes paper from Colombia, that uses in a sense, a design flaw in the program, which is that judges determined who got to be in the program or not, and the judges were random. The applicants were randomly assigned to judges, and some judges gave everybody the highest marks, and some judges gave everybody sort of middling to low marks. They had variation in strictness, and so you can go back and unpack, if this firm had a different judge, what would the outcome have been? And they find using that identification, they find that the non-monetary program has very large effects on average revenue growth, but it's all at the top end of the potential distribution. So they have both high potential firms who happen to get strict judges and therefore are excluded, and they have low potential firms that happen to get lax judge and therefore are included. So they have, for both the ends of the distribution, they have a a comparison sample, and they're able to show that the effect of the program is highest on those with the best, the highest potential distribution. Given the potential importance of these programs and the potential importance in terms of growth and job creation of these types of firms, I think we need a lot more work here. There's quite a lot of cross-sectional work with the Gali database, which is fantastic, cross-sectional and sort of instrumental variable kind of identify work, which is fantastic. But I think we need much more work in this area. Next topic I want to think about is mentoring and peer groups, and these are low cost, possibly scalable, although the limits to scaling are the mentors themselves, approach to providing knowledge and skills. The prototypical program is the Brooks et al. Type program in Kenya with relatively small scale female-owned microenterprises, in-person mentoring over a period of a fairly short period of time. And they show that there are significant benefits from that mentoring, and the mentors are people who have run businesses for longer periods of time and have larger businesses, so have been through the process that these smaller firms are going through on their way up, in a sense. They find significant benefits that tend to disappear over the period of a year. A less standard program is this Anderson et al. Paper in Uganda, which is mentoring at a distance. It's virtual mentoring. The mentors are based in higher income countries and come in on Zoom and have meetings with enterprises in Kenya. And maybe not surprisingly, they find no effects really on at the operational level and sort of helping firms with better bookkeeping or the kinds of sort of day-to-day operations, but they show that there are effects at the strategic level with what they call pivots. So thinking about what are the products you should be focused on, what's the strategy you should be taking, that at that level this works. Again, a paper that I find quite interesting in this regard is the coincidental paper from China. One, they have a very large sample; it's almost 3,000 firms, and therefore they place firms in groups of 10 for monthly meetings. Now, at one level, these are peers because some of the groups are quite homogeneous in sector and in size, and in other characteristics as well. So at one level, they're peers. At another level, in some of the groups where they have heterogeneity by size, heterogeneity by groups, other kinds of heterogeneity, you have something that looks more like mentors, and they find that the gains are largest for the mentees in these mixed groups, and there's other evidence as well that being matched with someone who is better than you, bigger than you, more experienced than you has the benefits. So let's go on to the next. Online learning, again, so this is something, of course, that we all recognize that sort of was stimulated and really came out of COVID-19. And there's some work, most of it new in this area. I'm just going to say we need a lot more work in understanding not only what's the effect of online training programs, but how do we best integrate online training programs with in-person training programs? What's the right mix to sort of get to lower the cost structure, but maintain the effectiveness of the programs? A few papers that I list here. Some evidence in some places that the attendance rates aren't affected by it being online. some evidence that there's effectiveness maybe in some of the larger, more MOOCs oriented training where you're meant to just watch a bunch of videos. The attendance is lower and the effectiveness is a bit more tenuous. So with that, let me wrap up with what we end the lit with, rather than going back over what we've just said. 5 things we think we've learned. One, entrepreneurship can be taught, and I'd go back to the original stuff that David talked about early in the presentation today. Better business practices matter for firms of all sizes. Training can at least modestly improve business practices. More intense consulting improves the performance, and innovating on content and delivery methods, I think in particular for training, is important, and it's something that we need to learn much more about. 5 places where there are knowledge gaps. What are the longer term effects of training? We're beginning to see some studies now with longer term effects in some of these areas. High turnover rates, high mortality rates of these firms makes that somewhat challenging, but we're beginning to see that. But we need more on that. How do we improve the cost effectiveness of training? We know this training works at times, but can we sort of push it down the size and scale level and make it cost effective? What are the factors that limit adoption of the practices that are trained? I think importantly, how do we make markets for training and consulting work better? So, most of these, a substantial part of these programs are sort of subsidized, paid for by funders and others. We need to figure out how to make the markets work better, and how do we design and evaluate incubator and accelerator programs. So I'll stop there. We'll leave it. We have some time then left for the questions. I'll turn it back over to Ali.
Great, thank you both for that super interesting and clear presentation. So I guess the first question I'll start off with is from Rania, who asks about essentially in this review, you've kind of separated businesses by their size, but she asks whether kind of other categorizations such as firm age or growth potential are important. And she also asked separately about, Chris, you talked about kind of identifying these high growth potential firms. Is that something that there's been work on? Is there evidence on how policymakers can figure out which firms are going to be high performing or not? So we'll start there.
So I'll jump in on the first. I would say it's true that in David's part of the presentation, and when we think about smaller firms, we tend to think we do tend to often think about things by size. I think when you get to things like incubation acceleration, that is often, and some of the mentoring programs, it's often age that's the relevant metric, and we are looking at firms that are tend to be startups and newer firms in the incubation acceleration type programs, and for mentors as well. There's a lot of focus on age. Maybe size is often easier to measure because age, when a firm starts, is it when it becomes formal? Is it when it starts the door? If a firm shifts, sectors, is it a new firm, and so forth? So I think just from a research perspective, sometimes we have, it's a somewhat more challenging sometimes to measure firm age. But I think on the mentoring side, at least my take, and David, you might say something about this, but is that's the case. In terms of identifying who the fast growers are, well, I would point to any sort of venture capital fund and say, when the venture capital funds get 1 out of 10 right, that they feel like they've done, or 2 out of 10 right, they feel like they've done well. So I think the answer is, we always struggle to figure out who at some level the firms that are gonna grow. At a very small scale, I could go back to some of the work that David and Suresh and I did a long time ago on separating, individuals who sort of employers from the self-employed, and there you do see some characteristics and demographics that tend to be associated with having a small firm as opposed to a micro firm. But at the fast-growing level, always a challenge.
you have anything to add, David, or shall I move
No,
on?
no,
to...
let's move on to other questions, I
Cool.
think.
Okay, so I'll go through two here and then I'll let you decide who responds to them. So we have one from Moritz who asks about whether you know if there's anywhere that kind of compiles different training curricula. So obviously this lit looks at like the evidence and kind of what works, but if there's somewhere that actually kind of combines the different curricula used on these different programs and puts them in one place. And then Sarah asked a question about the quality of training providers. It was mentioned a couple of times in the presentation, and asks whether there are best practices for kind of measuring training quality and whether current evidence has kind of signaled which specific provider characteristics are important for making training successful.
Yeah, so I can take a stab at a couple of those. So I think one of the issues in part is this sort of partly public, partly private offering of some of these trainings where a bunch of the content can be proprietary, can be developed by organizations that then license it out, etc. So there have been efforts by some organizations. I know the IFC has done this. I think Gideus Foundation has done this to try and sort of and Technoserve perhaps as well. I've seen sort of attempts to try and put together best practices from training, but an actual repository of this is the licensed training of the ILO, this is the licensed training curricula of this one, all in the same place that are publicly accessible. I don't think I've seen, and I think that partly because these are all sort of content that have been developed and owned by different organizations, but at least in terms of some of the best practices, I think there's been efforts on this. In terms of this measuring the quality of training providers, I think this is something certainly on the research side that there's been a lot of work in the education literature on how do you sort of measure teacher quality and how do you do this, and we really haven't done that work on the research side and in the training literature, in part because often our studies have too few trainers to do a lot on this. We've done some sorts of benchmarking where we're trying to measure, who are these trainers? Have they run businesses before? Have they worked for multinationals before? Some characteristics like that. But then in a typical study, you maybe have 5 or 10 trainers and just not enough variation to measure differences. And so a lot of the work is qualitative and anecdotal on some programs you just observe and the trainers don't seem that great. Others, they seem better, but in terms of I think that's an area where we do need more work, but we need much larger studies to be able to do it well.
Let me just jump in real quick on that and second that. I think we do need more work on this, and I think taking a page out of the education literature to figure out. I would point to one study. Valentina Asanova has a study where she looks at mentors, and the way she measures that how good the mentor is to go back to previous cohorts the mentors worked with and look at the. So that's kind of the way. Look at the outcomes from their mentees over time. That's kind of the way we tend to think about measuring quality teachers. It's problematic, but it's at least a step in the right direction. I think with training, we conceivably could do something similar and then begin to get measures of quality that you could map to characteristics of the trainers that might make some progress, at least sort of initial progress in kind of understanding what are the characteristics of higher quality trainers, because it's not even obvious whether it's education or experience or what it is that makes somebody a good trainer.
Great, thanks. A couple more questions. One from Marius, who asks whether there are any studies that kind of compare the effects of providing training to cost equivalent cash grants that go specifically to the kind of entrepreneurs or micro businesses in question. And then Rudy also asks about whether there's been any work on kind of training for refugees, specifically entrepreneurship training, I'll leave those two with you and then I'll come back.
So in terms of the benchmarking against cash, I think we've done this indirectly by looking at what we've seen from studies of returns to capital for these types of firms, and then comparing it to what we see as the returns to training, and at least often it's in the sort of similar ballpark is what I've seen. But there's a lot more studies that have sort of combined cash and training than have had arms that have a cash only arm, a training only arm, and a combined arm. And so I think there's a couple, but I don't think we haven't there's not a lot of systematic work that says training always is worse than cash or vice versa. So I haven't seen, maybe Chris can think off the top of his head of more that have done that benchmarking, but it tends to be on top of things versus what a horse race between them. So that's on the refugee training. This is not something that we have in the current version of the of this. And again, from the studies I've seen, they tend to be a bit more of these bundled programs where it's not just training, but it's training and some other things that are going to the refugees, in part because of this idea that refugees are in this vulnerable situation where they are lacking funds, and just giving them training without giving them some funds may not be that may not give them enough to work with. And so I think that's one of the challenges is trying to also keep this lit, which each time we do a revision gets a little bit longer from becoming too long, is how we deal with these bundled programs. And that's sort of something that we need to think a little bit more about.
Yeah, I'd just say on that, I just made it noted down the refugee question. I think it's a good question. I think we should look at that more carefully, because there are some things there. And I guess the question is, David, you're right, whether the training bit can be isolated and separated from the rest of what the programs provide. But that's something we should look more carefully at.
Great. And then I think we have time for two more questions that are kind of linked. So I'll pose them now. So the first is from Louisa, who asks about kind of whether there are gender differences in the effectiveness of standard training, and if there's also differences kind of considering other socioeconomic factors, and whether there's been any training programs that try to take that into account ahead of time and kind of tailor the training to certain groups. And then there's another question from someone who asks about whether there's been kind of any evidence yet on green entrepreneurship promotion. So kind of incorporating the green dimension into entrepreneurship training, and whether that's something that's been kind of attempted or studied.
So on the gender dimension, one of the sort of views from some of the early studies was that that traditional training didn't seem to be working as well for women as for men. But then, that didn't seem a very robust conclusion when we sort of started looking at it. And there's a lot of training programs that are only, with one group or another group. And so the number of studies that we have that have enough men and women for the same program in the same context is actually somewhat limited. I know from the personal initiative training that we found sort of similar impacts for men and women. Part of it is also whether you look at it in percentage terms or in absolute terms, because a lot of the female-owned businesses tend to start at a lower level, and so then you sometimes get higher percentage increases but lower level increases because they're starting at a lower base. And so I think these practices that most of these training programs are trying to teach are ones that, because they're trying to teach a very heterogeneous set of sectors and types of firms, they tend to focus on things that are very relevant across a whole range of firms, and they tend to therefore be relevant for both male and female-owned firms. As I mentioned, there are these additional constraints that seem to apply for women in some of the training programs, like the Get Ahead program that the ILO does, do try and alleviate or work on those constraints as well. We just haven't sort of seen whether the gender-specific elements of those do more on top of what these additional practices are, and the sort of impacts are in the same ballpark as a traditional training program. So I think that's and as we start getting to some of the larger firms, there's just not many female operated firms in these incubators, in these consulting things. And so we need to sort of think a little bit more about how to evaluate those types of firms, as well as how to attract enough women to look at heterogeneity. The green area is one it's definitely growing, but I have not seen any studies that have specifically looked at that yet. And I think, that's certainly something that we hope will come up in the next, versions down the line. But so far, I think the sample sizes tend to be pretty small for the types of programs I've seen, where, maybe you're helping 20 people at a time to work on a, because it's one industry or one very specific, solar training or something. I haven't seen things that have done, 1,000 firms all in training on green at the moment.
Great, thanks for that. I think that's all we have time for today. There were quite a few more questions than we had time to get around to, but I'll be able to pull a copy of all of them and pass them to Chris and David so that they can see them after the presentation. Thanks again for everyone joining this. I've just put a link in the chat to where you can download and read the full version of issue 3 of this lit, and also keep your eye on our social media pages, because we have quite a few more new VoxDevLits coming out over the coming months, which we're really excited about, and we'll also have launch events like this one. So
yeah, thanks everyone for those comments, and we will definitely look through them and try and see what we can incorporate for the next version. And if there's new studies that you come across, please send them to us, so that we want this to be a community literature as well. So thanks.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Thanks.